Land 4 is one of those games that you may have heard of but you might not have played. It's a game that's considered by its fans to be one of the greats, although it's not remembered as much as some. You may not have come across this game because of how the character himself has evolved. You most likely know about Wario as a character more than his line of games, from his role in the Mario spin-offs to his playable status in Smash to WarioWare. In fact, you probably know WarioWare more than you know Wario Land. Personally, I'm more of a fan of Wario Land than WarioWare. Now, the WarioWare games are good, but that's not how Wario started. But why did Nintendo switch gears from the puzzle platform genre that he originally starred in into the micro game mayhem that you see today? I will answer all these questions and more as we discuss Wario Land 4. Did not mean for that to rhyme. If I haven't made it clear, I'm a Wario Land fan. But what about these games, and more specifically the game in question, Wario Land 4, are so fun, and why do I like them? Wario is absolutely one of the most iconic Mario characters. In fact, he was so popular that after his introduction as a villain in Super Mario Land 2, The 6 Golden Coins, they made the third entry about him, Wario Land, Super Mario Land 3. Wario Land was interesting. Yes, it did follow the Mario formula, using power-ups to get to the end of the stage, although it shook things up a bit. Wario was slower, almost invulnerable. Only spikes, certain enemies, and bottomless pits could damage him. You can see it not just in his defense, but his offensive moveset too. Let's look at Wario's stature. He's a big, mean brute who will let nothing stand in his way. It was even the game where his iconic shoulder bash was introduced, and even had a ground pound before Mario did. The game is sort of an inverse of how Mario games work, just how Wario is an inverse of Mario. Mario games are usually about going as fast as you can to get to the end of a stage, avoiding obstacles and enemies, essentially a 2D obstacle course. Wario, on the other hand, was more about the exploration with an emphasis on collecting treasure and goodies. The levels are bigger, slower, and less linear. Some even have secret exits. There's not even a run button. You can see this even going into the premise. Instead of the usual selfless heroism of Mario going to save the princess, Wario has a selfish motive of stealing treasure from the brown sugar pirates, who act as the antagonists of the game, with Captain Syrup as their leader. They make another appearance in the second game and try to steal all the treasure that Wario stole from them back. Wario's greed and selfishness are just as present here as the Mario's selflessness. While Mario is willing to take on incredible odds to save someone else, Wario is willing to take those same odds but is for his own selfish gain, such as taking on an entire gang of pirates himself. It's really brilliant in its execution. To top it off, the game is actually really fun too. Now, I'm probably the only person to give this character and this game this much thought to its depth, so let's move on. With Wario Land being a successful hit, Nintendo sought to make another one, and so they did, on the Virtual Boy. Say what you will about the Virtual Boy, and many have, it's a pretty terrible console, but Virtual Boy Wario Land is quite the opposite and is pretty much, in my opinion, the only game worth playing on the console. It took the concepts of the previous game and ran with them. The sprites are bigger and better looking and better animated. They also made the game a bit faster with the added run button. The levels are bigger with a treasure and key to find in each. Even more of a focus was put on exploration in this game, which is a sign of the way the series would go. Although a bit short, only 12 levels, it's still worth playing in my opinion. Because it was on the Virtual Boy, it needed to be, 3D. Which just means that Wario can jump into the background using these pads, which is the gimmick of the game. It's neat, and I don't think it gets in the way, or really adds anything, it's just sort of there. It's a fun little game that if you get the chance to play it, you should. And if you play it with the right emulator, you can adjust it to be just black and white, making it much more bearable than the red and black, which is what you're seeing. I didn't even need to color correct it. I won't go into too much detail because the true sequel would be released not long after, Wario Land 2. Wario Land 2 is a bit of a different game than the first one. It's sort of where the series started to find its own identity. It was one of those games that got the black cartridge, which meant you could play it on both the original Game Boy or the Game Boy Color with, well, full color. Wario Land 2 threw out the Mario way of doing things altogether and made it a little more Metroidvania-esque, if I can say that. which makes sense because the same people that made Metroid also made this game. Each level still has a goal, but it's not so cut and dry as getting to the door or a flagpole as Mario does, but rather accomplishing certain tasks. Shut off the water faucet that's flooding your house. Return the chicken back to its spot. Yes, Wario has a pet chicken. Make your way to and defeat a boss. There's also treasure for you to find with a really unforgiving memory minigame to unlock it. Like, what? How was I supposed to see that? Yeah, at least they're optional. They didn't just toss the Mario formula with the level design, but also with the power-ups. Wario is now completely invulnerable. If you get hit by an enemy, it just sends you back and you lose a few coins and time. Instead of power-ups, he now has context-sensitive transformations. Wario gets crushed. Instead of dying, Wario will go flat and is now able to reach this area. Wario gets stung by a bee. Instead of losing a life, Wario will puff up like a balloon and is now able to float. Wario catches on fire. Now he's able to break these specific blocks. Don't worry, he's okay. Wario uses these transformations to explore new areas and find secrets. Speaking of secrets, nice segue, the secret exits also make a return, or rather alternative paths. Yeah, Wario Land 2 has multiple endings, which are exclusive to this game. Not every level has one, only a few like here in Captain Syrup's ship. I can either sink the ship by breaking this block, or I could drop this anchor and stop the ship. Or you could just simply not wake up in the beginning. These alternative paths will usually lead to a new ending, making the game very replayable and surprisingly a lot of content for a Game Boy Color game. Wario would get one more title on the Game Boy hardware, this time fully on the Game Boy Color. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Wario Land 3. Probably a lot of people's favorite in the series, it took Wario Land 2's open levels and turned it up to 11. The game, for all intents and purposes, is a proper Metroidvania. Wario needs to find keys in levels to take those keys to chests to get a treasure which advances the game. Most of the time, these treasures will be an item that unlocks a new path on the world map. You'll be going back and forth on it, going to one level, then to another, then backtracking to another. Another way this is a Metroidvania is that Wario starts out pretty weak and will gain upgrades to his powers, which gives you access to different paths of the levels. While Wario is still invincible, he doesn't have access to the full extent of his abilities that he had in Wario Land 2 and needs to earn them. Maybe it was because he hit his head or something when the plane crashed and forgot. The transformations make a return and operate just as they did in the previous game, and have been given a nice graphical upgrade along with the rest of his animations. This is really the only game to take this Metroidvania-like approach. The game is a hallmark of the Game Boy Color, and is really a must-play for not just Wario fans, but Metroidvania fans. Give it a shot. They also put it on the Switch Online service for the Game Boy if you have access to that. As you can see, Wario went through a lot of, transformation. Okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. But each new game brought something new and iterated and improved upon each one. They're honestly really iconic Game Boy games and are really the games that I think about when somebody mentions the Game Boy. I wouldn't say they hit their peak until the 4th entry on the Game Boy Advance, and what this video has been leading up to, Wario Land 4. The first thing you'll notice about Wario Land 4 is, well, what's staring you right in the face? The visuals. The colors are very vibrant and almost overly saturated, and there's a good reason for this. You see, Wario Land 4 came out at a time where the only GBA available was this one, the one without the backlight. The screen is so infamous for being the absolute worst, so Wario Land 4 didn't look like this, it looked like this. Developers of the Game Boy Advance needed to make visual compromises by washing out the colors just so people could see their games on this awful screen. Wario Land 4 came out in the middle of this time, and in my opinion, the developers played right into this limitation. They knew they needed to make the game bright and colorful so that it could be seen, so they opted to make the game more silly and playful as a result. Wario was the perfect candidate for this, as he's already a pretty silly character himself. Heck, the transformations in the previous games were already a sign of this. Thematically, all this color makes sense for the game, and doesn't feel at all like a compromise, but feels like an intentional design choice. And while a game like the port of Donkey Kong Country suffered thematically because the original look of the game needed to be compromised for this limitation, Wario Land 4 thrives because the game was built around that. So presentation-wise, it is very fitting of Wario and the direction they wanted to take him. Just as much as the visuals complement the game, so does the story. Just about every Wario Land game at this point has had an intro cutscene, just to contextualize your adventure. Wario Land 2 shows you how the brown sugar pirate stole his treasure from his house. And Wario Land 3 shows him crashing in his plane and finding the music box that he gets trapped in. This intro starts out oddly cinematic and mysterious. It starts out with a night cityscape and pans down. Then we see Wario's legs, honestly a bit cursed. We see him start his car and him driving down the road. Then we cut to this cat that Wario almost runs over, sheesh. But then we see a newspaper fly in its face, which reveals what Wario was after. Pyramid discovered, it says at the top. This time, Wario's adventure is not forced like the previous two. He's simply after treasure. First off, I love this vocal theme that plays during the intro and into the title card. Nothing like it has been done in other games. Granted, they couldn't on the limited hardware that they were working with, but we're no longer under the limitations of the Game Boy. This is the Game Boy Advance. You can have good music in your game. Well, almost. The Game Boy Advance's sound chip is pretty notorious for being kind of grating, but here, the way they made the music here is pretty soft. The tracks are nice and even get a bit weird, but it always fits what your surroundings are. This intro song is really iconic. It's one of the only songs on the GPA that has voice lines in it. Speaking of which, I really like the compressed voice clips of Wario. They really add to the charm of the game. And they would also be used in the WarioWare game that would come out 2 years later. Honestly, as objectively bad as the Game Boy Advance's sound hardware is, it is just incredibly nostalgic to me. The Game Boy Advance was the first console I owned as a kid, and is still one of my favorites. Starting a new game, we'll see Wario finding and running up into the pyramid and finding that same cat. Then he just jumps right in this hole. Wow, Wario really will do anything for treasure. From there, we are introduced to the hub. I'll talk about this hub in just a moment once it opens up, but right now, all we can do is go into this tutorial level. And really from there, that's where the story backs off until the end, so once we get there, I'll talk about it. I'll say this though, this is probably the most story you will ever get out of a game set in the Mario universe, aside from the RPGs of course. I say it that way because this isn't a Mario game, it's a Wario game. And we don't need Mario here to steal a spotlight. In fact, after the first game, there was never really any mention of the main Mario cast, just the original characters that the series introduced. Although, even in this game, the only returning characters are just Wario himself. The only reason that first one was called Super Mario Land 3 was because it needed to be recognizable so people would buy it. After the first one, there was no need for the Mario brand attachment. Wario was popular enough on his own. Story has never really been the main focus of most Nintendo games. It's always been about the gameplay, which is the part that Wario Land 4 gets so right. Let's start by talking about this tutorial level. This tutorial is honestly one of the best tutorials I've seen in a video game, and I'd like to analyze it. That's probably something you haven't heard before. Wario Land 4's tutorial is one of the best. It barely has one, and frankly, who cares? But see, that is just my point. It's subtle. So check this out. You load in the first room, and you see this frog statue looking thing that looks just like the one you jumped on to get in here, with an arrow pointing to it. But it's on the other side of this wall. This is the game telling you what your goal is without pulling you away from the experience of the game itself. It's actually more subtle than you might realize. I didn't really notice it the first time I played, and that is really what makes this tutorial level so great. It doesn't feel like a tutorial, but an actual level. From here, we jump up on these platforms and see these transparent blocks. An observant player might be able to make out the face of a frog, and may even be able to connect the two. The game will teach you what these are towards the end, but let's move on for now. Going down this pipe will lead us to our first enemy encounter. These enemies are completely harmless. They aren't here to offer a challenge, but rather to teach you something. If you run into them, boom, they bounce off of Wario and neither of you takes damage. This is communicating to the player that not every enemy in the game can damage you. You have a heart counter, so obviously you can take damage, just not from these guys. It also subtly communicates Wario's toughness. He can stand a little bit more than Mario, who takes damage even if a Goomba runs into him. That big gut ain't just for looks. This is technically a Mario game, right? So what happens when you jump on an enemy? Right here is yet again where the game is communicating that Wario is different from Mario. When Mario jumps on an enemy, they die usually. If Wario jumps on an enemy, they just get knocked down. But why? Well, check this out. If you run into them while they're knocked down, you automatically pick them up. Okay, so they don't die if I jump onto them or if I run into them. Then how do I get rid of these guys? Well, let's try out that B button. Boom! Wario runs straight into them and knocks them off screen with them dropping coins. Wario's shoulder bash has been around since the first game and has stuck with him throughout the series. Not only is it a fun movement tool and attack, giving Wario bursts of speed when he's usually slow, but it also continues to communicate to the player what type of person Wario is. He's a bully, a brute, not someone you want to run into in the school halls. And he'd probably steal your lunch money and do it with little trouble. And what about these coins? Well, when you pick them up, this number in the top left goes up, communicating once again what your goal is. Collect as much money as you can. Now, does this room communicate all of that outright? No, but a thoughtful and methodical player could try out all that stuff. It's the freedom this level gives the player to put the pieces together that makes it great. Moving on to the next room here. You still see the same enemies, but run straight into a chest. And if you've been messing with the controls, you'll find that shoulder bash will open it, and you get a gem of some kind. And Wario will have a voice line of some kind celebrating the fact that he got it. I'd say this is important. The next few rooms will teach you your movement options. Here, you are properly introduced to the shoulder bash, a new move called the super arm slam, which breaks these tougher blocks that a regular bash can't. And if you take this knowledge into the next room, you get a little bit of a spectacle. You find that not much can actually stop this move, only these tougher blocks. And if you slow down a little bit and broke these other blocks, you'll find a big diamond. What the game is subtly communicating to you here is that there are secrets to find, and if you keep an eye out, you may just get something special. You'll learn about throwing items, rolling, and ground pounding, but if you are still keeping an eye out, you'll find this hidden room with not only a secret, but a new enemy type. Now, some players might fall in this hole and try to attack this guy when he's facing him. This is communicating another thing. Wario is not invincible. He can die. And you need to be careful about what you're attacking and how you are attacking. You also find that those gem chests form one singular gem, which will be important in a bit. You also find a key ghost thing, which you grab, mostly because there's not really a way to miss it. In the final room, you get back to the frog switch. Now, you saw Wario jump on the switch to enter the level, so what happens when you jump on this one? This right here is probably the most important moment in Wario Land Forest tutorial. When you jump on that switch, the room gets weird. The music changes to this frantic piece that actually gets pretty good the further it gets into it. A timer shows up, and those solid blue blocks turn into those transparent blocks that you saw at the beginning. And that little portal that you couldn't get through opens back up. In just a few seconds, Wario Land 4 taught you several things. Number one, in order to finish this level, you need to hit that blue switch, and you need to get back to the start of the level. Number two, when you hit that blue switch, some paths will be blocked and others will be open, making it so you need to reroute your way back to the start, and you can't just go back the same way you came. And finally, number three, you will need to do it fast, so you don't have time to dawdle and look for goodies. Save that for before you hit the switch. Once you hit it, it's go time. I also like that they give you a little challenge to do under the time pressure, telling you that you may have to do things under a time crunch. Once you get out, you find what that key and gem are for. You actually need them for progressing, so you can't miss those. Wario Land 4's tutorial taught you that without getting in your face about it. It taught you all that subtly and even sometimes acted as if it was your idea. I think this is something that is lost in today's modern video game world. At least Nintendo's. They spend far too much time teaching you about the game instead of just letting the player figure it out on their own. Now there's a pretty good reason for that. See, Wario Land 4 came out at a time where instruction manuals were pretty standard, so games didn't need to teach you how to play in the game, nor did they need to tell you all of their story there. Instruction manuals have become pretty superfluous. Games don't even come with them anymore, so it's up to the game itself to teach the player how to play. Now, for some people, they might need a more in-depth tutorial. That's not a bad thing. But for others, having the game tell you like you're 5 how to play the game might be a bit mildly insulting. Now, I personally can get a kick out of the game's NPCs telling you to move and such like they're actually talking to the player character, but really only the first time. If I ever come back to a game, I'd really like to just skip all that and play the game. And that's another pitfall most modern Nintendo games fall into, the unskippable tutorial. Wario Land 4's tutorial may not be skippable, but it's subtle, and it doesn't feel like it's even there. It feels like a short level that you can just speed through and not an arbitrary tutorial. It does, however, give you these non-intrusive button prompts that look like hieroglyphs and look like they belong there. I guess my point is that tutorials are really a delicate balance because you never know what type of player you're dealing with. But I think giving the player a choice is always the right way to go about it. And I think Wario Land 4 is a shining example of how to do it. I've rambled far too long about the nuances of tutorials in video games, so let's get back to the game at hand. Wario's controls are buttery smooth and honestly one of the best feeling 2D platformers that I've ever played. I did somewhat go over Wario's movement, but I'll expand upon it here. All of his titular movement is here, from his ground pound, his shoulder bash, and crawling. But he's got something new. This super arm slam. Basically, Wario flails his arms and runs like a madman, busting through just about anything in his path, giving this game a very speed-like feel. This game is way more fast-paced than its predecessors. In fact, everything else that he could do returns, but he just does it faster. That's not to say the explorative part of the game is gone. You still need to scour high and low in these levels to find 4 chests that will unlock the boss door, and the key that will open up the next level. On the world map here, you have 4 different areas you can go to, each varying in difficulty. Thing is, you can take on any of these areas at any point. Even if you're in the middle of doing another area, you can go and start a new one if you so desire, or if you're stuck on a level, you can just go try another one, making Wario Land 4 the most open-ended Wario Land game in the series. Despite that, Wario Land 4 is a relatively short game. You can realistically beat it in just a few hours. The game doesn't waste your time. Wario Land 4 knows what it wants and sticks to it. There's very little filler, if any, in this game at all. It's the most replayable game in the series, focusing on execution rather than sheer exploration. That doesn't mean exploring is gone though. Each level still has secrets and hidden areas. These CDs you can collect are hidden pretty well for those looking for more than just action and execution. Each level has so much variety and intrigue to them that you never really notice the short length, and it's really shown off in the gameplay loop. No, it's really a loop. Here, let me show you. You start at the beginning of a stage and go through the level collecting the 4 chests and the key. Then hit the frog switch and run back to the start in the proper amount of time. Sometimes you will go back the way you came. Other times you'll take a completely different path that will take you back to the start, maybe finding the remaining chests along that path. That may sound repetitive, but I would say that it plays to the short length of the game. Each level may follow the same formula, but that by no means makes each level the same. Oh no, each level is different and distinct. In one level, you'll be climbing a tree to get to the top to find the key and the frog switch. Another, you'll be exploring a lava cave that when you hit the switch, turns the whole level and enemies to ice. And yet another will see you climbing a haunted hotel, then go as fast as you can to get back to the bottom. This variety really keeps the game fresh and interesting, and I never really found myself getting bored with it. The level design sort of combines Wario Land 2 and 3. I would say it leans into 2 a little bit more, but that doesn't make it the same. They're not as open-ended as the third one, and there's not really any backtracking unless you missed a piece of a gem. The levels are pretty straightforward, with secrets being off the beaten path, with the game asking you to notice something off or different about a tile so you can break it and find your secret, or maybe you can see the secret, but you need to find a way around to it. It's not just a straightforward shot to the key and then just go back the same way to the portal. No, each room is pretty open. You may have to platform vertically up or down or break a few blocks to find the path forward. Some levels will even change or have a different path entirely back to the start. I never felt like I was getting lost in these levels. The level design is just so intuitive that it guides you along without outright telling you where to go, just like a certain other franchise that this team worked on. Each level is really fun and engaging with a new mechanic. I think this is a good time to talk about the transformations. A good bit of them make a return, from Puffy Wario to Flat Wario and Fire Wario. Each transformation has its own use. You can use Puffy Wario to get higher or use Fire Wario to break these specific blocks to progress, kind of like in the old games. They're used pretty cleverly, and sometimes you may even need to use your head to solve a puzzle with them. Like here with the Snowball transformation, you need to select the right path to properly roll down to find your way to progress. They're all pretty fun to try to figure out how to use them properly to accomplish what needs to be done. Each area features 4 levels and a boss. The bosses have a timer of their own, and there's more of a consequence than just having to start over if you take too long. Each boss has 3 chests, and at a certain time, the chests will begin to disappear, and you only get to keep as many as are left when you beat the boss. If you're fast enough, you can keep all the chests, which affects the ending you'll get. The final boss only appears once you beat all the other bosses, and in that one you're fighting for all the chests you've earned over the course of the game. The bosses look very different from what you see in your average Mario game. They're more grotesque, like something out of Metroid. Well, maybe not all of them, but they're all pretty unique and all have a different challenge to offer. As you get the boss down to low health, they'll go into a rage mode of sorts and change up their attack patterns, giving them even a more grotesque look and upping the challenge towards the end. They're all uniquely designed and all make for a great cap-off to each area. Wario Land 4 is a little more to offer than its main story, primarily minigames and a sound test. Minigames have always been a part of Wario Land, whether you're gambling your money away or trying to golf. The minigames have always been mandatory for completion. The minigames offered here, however, are optional. They can be just a little distraction, but the reward for beating them are these coins that you use to buy items to reduce the boss's health from the start of a battle. They're high score based, so you could potentially spend a lot of time here if you're into that sort of thing. Although there's nothing here that interests me too much, an endless runner, a face-matching game, and a home run derby, but the sound test on the other hand. In the main game, you'll find these chests that hold CDs. These CDs unlock sounds in the sound test. Usually with sound tests, it's a compilation of all the music and sound effects in the game. And while some of that is there, it's not all there is. There's a bunch of really wacky and random sounds and music too. I could pick any one of these and it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. And this weird dude dressed up as Wario, it's also surreal and kind of reminds me of Sonic's CD sound test and how you could get some freaky results. But enough of that, on to the last bit of the game. Once you get to the final boss, the cat tries to attack the boss, but it gets trapped inside its nose, I guess. I don't know what's happening here, but once you beat it, it releases the cat and you escape together, with all the treasure you collected, of course. I mean, that's why you're here in the first place, you know? Side note, you really could put Wario on any adventure and just give the excuse that he was searching for treasure there. It honestly makes him a surprisingly versatile character. Anyways, both of you escape the pyramid and watch it crumble. Then the cat was revealed to be a princess. She gives Wario a kiss and ascends to the heavens. This is where the different endings come into play. If you got all the treasure, she will be a beautiful princess. And if you got less and less treasure, she will become uglier and uglier. To which Wario reacts accordingly. And it's pretty funny to watch, if not a little superficial. And so ends Wario Land 4. Wario Land 4 was the last time Nintendo themselves held the reins for the series. They would later give a different developer a try with Wario Land Shake It, or the Shake Dimension for PAL regions. It held its own charm with its hand-drawn graphic style and did follow a similar formula to this one, but I felt like it didn't have the same polish as 4 and took out a lot of what I think makes this game so good. I guess in Universe, Wario just thought it was easier to gain money by starting a business than risking his own life going on adventure. Because after this, WarioWare was really all you saw Nintendo use Wario for. You know, I think I know the actual reason why Nintendo stopped making Wario Land. After Super Mario Land 2, Mario started to break ground in other areas like in the realm of 3D, and Wario was filling the void of 2D platformers left by Mario with Wario Land. But then something else happened. Nintendo started to introduce a new generation to 2D Mario with the Super Mario Advance series, and then with the new Super Mario Bros. Series. And with Mario back in the 2D realm, I guess they thought it would be redundant to keep Wario there. So they put him in WarioWare, bringing an end to the era of Wario Land. If you want my opinion, I still think Wario Land could exist beside 2D Mario. I mean, they're different enough. Wario Land is not about going through a level, dodging ever-increasing obstacles to get to the end of a stage, but rather taking it slow, exploring, solving puzzles, looking for treasure, and having a whole lot of fun while doing it. But while we may never get another Wario Land game, and I hope Nintendo proves me wrong, what I do know is this: they put their all into Wario Land 4. It is polished to near perfection for a 2D platformer, and is one of the best I've really played. I mentioned this on the channel before, that Super Mario World held the title for me as my favorite 2D Mario game. And if we're talking just the main series, yes it is. But that was before I played this game. And now that I have, I honestly can say that it's even with, if not higher than Mario World. Admittedly, I was always a fan of the first one, but thought that I wouldn't play the other Wario Land games because of their puzzly nature. That is until I played a different game made by the same developer, Super Metroid, which was another series that I thought I would always appreciate from afar. But once I did play it, I started to look for similar experiences and ultimately played this one. What I noticed is that Wario really does take a lot of cues from Metroid. The third one is a full-on Metroidvania after all. These games have so much creativity and charm and are some of my favorites. And frankly, the 16-bit generation is my favorite generation of video games, and I think Wario Land 4 stands right up with them all. Wario Land 4 is a great game that does a fantastic job of mixing puzzle platforming with action platforming. I really recommend it to anyone who hasn't played it. You'll have a great time. But until then, I've been Travelopolis, and you guys take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.